Hey there, everyone. It's Baga here, and welcome to the first episode of Uncanny, the show where we're going to talk about comic books and honestly, whatever I feel like doing. Now, this show is going to take a bit of a twisting and turning as we go. Not every episode is going to be the same thing. Sometimes we might have some guests. We might have an interview or two here and there if I can get that lucky. But probably for the most part, we're just going to talk about comics. And it's not a comic book news show. We're not going to talk about the latest and greatest things unless I find something to be really, really interesting. I just have a lot of thoughts on comics. I have been collecting comics for about 20 years now. And I've loved them. I love the art form. I love the writing that goes along with them. And it's just something that I think is interesting and is something I'm very passionate about. So, for this episode, I want to focus on one big thing. And it's a question that a lot of my high school students ask me because they know that I'm a comic book guy. And some of them are interested in it, but really have never gotten into it. They'll go to the library and they might pick out some manga here and there, but they haven't gotten into many American comics. And that's really where my passion is. I like manga. I read a lot of manga, but I read a ton of comics. And the question they ask me is, what comic book should I read to start things out? What can get me in? And it's kind of the gateway drug question, you know. Which comic book is the best one to start me off, you know? And this is a difficult question to answer because it's not like if somebody asks you what sci-fi novel should I read. I kind of want to get into sci-fi. I like sci-fi movies. What book should I read to get into it? To me, that answer personally is a somewhat easier one. I would say read Ender's Game. It's a great way to get into sci-fi. It's not too sci-fi-ish. Now, if you continue with the series, it gets majorly that way. You know, if you ask me what fantasy novel should I read to start with, I would go with The Hobbit or Lord of the Rings. But comic books, unlike that, it's not genre specific. Comic books go through tons of genres. There's sci-fi, there's fantasy, there's superpowers, there's detective, there's mystery, there's romance. There's comics for adults, comics for children, comics for teens, you know, team comics, solo comics, comics about real life. It runs the gamut of all of these different types of genres. So there's not one answer I can give as to, you know, what comic should I start with. What I would say is, you know, what do you like? This is you have to answer the question with a question. What types of things do you like? Are you into sci-fi? Are you into fantasy? Do you want to read superhero comics? Do you want to read anti-superhero comics? Do you want the idea of superpowers in a fantasy world like that, but you don't want capes and spandex? So I'm going to list a few in some of these subgenres that I think are great reads and are great ways to enter it. And the first, I'm not going to start with superheroes. The first thing I'm going to do is start with comics for teens, specifically with their age range in mind, because these are the people who ask me these questions the most. Now, if you're 18 and you're wanting to read a superpower type comic, but not straight into superheroes because you might think they're a little on the lame side, I highly recommend reading Runaways. It is about a group of teenagers who find out that their parents are actually supervillains, and some of them find out they've got power, some of them find out, you know, they inherit some mad scientist tech or a psychic dinosaur, one's a mutant, things along those lines. You've got tech, you've got superpowers, you've got magic, you've got all these sorts of things in there. And it's about them surviving and about them becoming a family together. And you get a lot of crazy things. You do get some superhero crossovers along the way because it's Marvel Comics and they want to integrate series like this into their mainstream. Now, they've had a lot of writers on this. Specifically, two of the big ones are Brian K. Vaughan, I'm not sure how to pronounce his last name, and Joss Whedon, the master Joss Whedon himself. Very different takes on the story, but both very good takes. Now, if you are wanting to get into superhero comics, and you want kind of that nice, classic story, and you want some of these mainstream, you want to experience the movie universes as comic book form. Any of the Avengers books that are currently out are great. Plenty of Avengers graphic novels. I highly recommend going with the New Avengers in the graphic novel form. If you were to go with mainstream comics today, possibly the straight up Avengers series. If you are more into the X-Men mode, reading any of the X-Men series now, I'm loving all of them, honestly. They were in the toilet for me for a long time. They're back. Graphic novel wise, find something that starts you off with the Jim Lee run of X-Men, the Andy Kubert run. When I first really, really got into comics, knowing what I was doing, it was with X-Men number 25, written by Fabian Nicieza, with art by Andy Kubert. And it was the story where Magneto rips the adamantium out of Wolverine's skeleton. And then Professor Xavier mind wipes Magneto. It's a major storyline in X-Men history. And that was what got me started, and that's what got me hooked on comics. And it just exploded from there. Now, DC-wise, Batman's the big thing. Honestly, I'm not a big fan of the New 52, which is what DC Comics is right now. It's their current universe. But the Batman stories are all pretty darn good. The Court of Owls storyline is really good. If you want to go back a little further to more, early 2000s Batman, the Batman Hush storyline is excellent. The Superman for Tomorrow series is really good, and that's also another Jim Lee type of thing. So those are some classic superhero books. I would find graphic novels. That's a great way to get into comics because it's got the whole storyline. You don't have to wait month by month, issue for issue. You can dive in, get some stories, test some things out. You can always find these things with discounts. They're at bookstores. They're at discount bookstores. They're at comic book stores. And you can get a really good idea of what these stories are about. And if you like them, great. If you don't like them, you're not out that much for what you're getting. Now, if you are an adult and you are wanting something that is not superhero, that is a little grittier, but it's still kind of mainstreamish, I recommend Powers. Powers is a great detective series where they are investigating homicides with superpowered based victims or criminals. There are tons of graphic novels in that, and with that series you pretty much need to start at the beginning because there's a lot of mythos that goes into it. Wanted, which is right there, is another great non-superhero story. There are powered people. They made a movie out of this, which is nothing like the comic book. The comic book is far superior in my opinion. This is written by Mark Millar with art by J.G. Jones. And it's the story of criminals, super criminals. There's no superheroes left. It's really gritty. It's really explicit. So it's not for kids. Now, if you're wanting something that is far more off the beaten path, I love The Umbrella Academy. It's a great series. Sandman by Neil Gaiman is always a good one. So, there are hundreds, thousands of choices out there. What are you into? If you just look at the background behind me, I've got stuff from all over. I've got, Fables, which is a non-superhero. It's a fantasy-based story set in the real world. Deadpool, which is your non-classic superhero story. Birds of Prey, which is a DC former, well, I guess it's still around. The good stuff was former DC stuff. Watchmen, which is one of the grittiest graphic novels. I've got Batman: The Dark Knight Returns, another gritty superhero comic. Great classic team books like JSA. There are lots of good graphic novels in that. If you really want classic stuff, they've got Marvel sells Marvel Essentials, which are black and white copies, very thick tomes of classic superhero comics. They have in Spider-Man, X-Men, X-Factor, Avengers, Captain America, etc., etc., etc. DC has something similar, but it's not nearly as widespread. It's a lot harder to find. You can find those essentials a lot of places. Even a lot of bookstores will carry some of them. I think, X-Men has got 20 plus volumes, and they're still putting them together. If you're just starting, don't waste your time with hardcovers. That's a lot more expensive. Go with something that looks interesting to you. Try something new. You're never going to know until you try. So that's going to do it for this week's Uncanny. This show will be back in 2 weeks. Next week we're going to have a top 5. This next Wednesday we'll have another Wide World of Geek. So until next time, this is Bach, and I'll see you guys later.